Raise your hand if you're asleep by now from the last talk. There's a few people asleep at the back. Okay. Well, I'll do my best to try and keep you awake for the final 20 minutes. My name's Jon Leighton, and we heard from Josh earlier. Josh is my friend. He's on the Travis team. And you may have noticed that he's a Kiwi. He's from New Zealand. So Josh actually calls me Jon Leighton, that's okay too. I work for Loco2. We're a company trying to make European rail travel easy. If you've ever travelled by rail in Europe, you'll know that it's not easy at the moment. And I actually came here to Poland on the train. So yes, I did come to a Rails conference by rail. I even thought about Rails on the train. And I've got a few hobbies. So I quite like dancing. This is me. I went to a conference in Moscow in February, and do you guys know Greg Pollock, that does Rails Envy? He was trying out a new thing called Dance School. He does Code School, and so I was helping him with that. Another hobby I have is climbing, rock climbing. So this is me pulling through the final moves. And you may know me as a member of the Rails core team. This is just a subset of the team, I should say that. I hope no one feels left out by this. Okay, now I'm going to do the actual talk. I'm going to talk about testing, and specifically I'm going to talk about controller testing. And I'm going to talk about controllers from the perspective of what I was trying to do to make my test suite run really fast. So there's been a lot of discussion in the community about how slow it is to test Rails, and I was trying to think about that and make my suite faster. And this led me to be dissatisfied with how Rails controllers work at present. And so I thought about what I would like it to be, and then I've actually changed the way that I'm writing my controller code in response to this. And as a result, I'm having a lot of a happier time while I'm testing. So I have a question. How many of you enjoy testing your controllers? Come on, guys. Isn't it fun? How many people have controller test suites that run really, really fast, less than a second? I can't think what could be the problem. Well, fast tests are unit tests. And this is a fact. If you think I'm wrong, you're wrong. Okay, if your test is slow, it is not a unit test. I guarantee that. And I hate to break it to you, but the tests that we write for controllers out of the box with Rails are not unit tests. In fact, you already know that because they're called functional tests. But let me tell you what actually happens when you write a functional test. You generate a big hash, which is basically a web request that goes through the entire rack stack of your controller, and all your filters run and everything runs. Also, you can test some small piece of logic in one method called defIndex or defNew in your controller. And this is, unsurprisingly, very expensive. And it's not a unit test. So what I wanted to be able to do is unit test my controllers. So I don't know how many people in this room do work on projects that are not Rails, but I've worked on a few, and whenever I do this, I get this immense sort of happy feeling that everything's really easy, and my tests run in less than a second for all of my unit tests, and everything's just fine. And then I come into a Rails project, and it suddenly feels like I'm dragging a millstone across the stage, and it makes me sad. So I tried to think about what is it that I do differently in a Rails project to what I do in any other piece of code, any other Ruby project. And so I was thinking about what is the essence of a unit test. And I think the first thing is that you need to instantiate the object under test. The second thing is you generally call a method, and that method is a unit of work that you're actually trying to test. And finally, you need to then check something, make some assertions, or if you're using mocking, as Tom talked about, you'll verify some expectations. Now, I want to compare this to what happens in a Rails functional test. And the code we're going to be looking at is based on scaffolding. I'm not picking out scaffolding. This is just some example code to look at. It's applicable to any sort of functional test in Rails. So firstly, we instantiate the object. Where do we instantiate the object? Can anyone see us instantiating the object there? No? Well, actually what happens is Rails, we called the test post controller test. And on the basis of that, Rails assumes that we're using the post controller and it instantiates it. And it also instantiates a bunch of other objects. So there's a request object and there's a response object. And there's actually generally quite a lot of ceremony involved in setting up this object. And so the reason that we don't instantiate it here is actually we used to, if you've used Rails for a while, you'll know that we used to instantiate the object. And that got quite repetitive and got quite boring. And so that was abstracted out. But as a result, it's now less clear how that object is being created and what its dependencies are. How about calling a method? Well, can anyone see us calling a method on a controller object here? We're actually not. We're calling this helper method called put, which is something to do with HTTP. Why do I care about HTTP when I'm unit testing a method? And finally, assertions and expectations. We have a bunch of quite specific stuff for Rails that we use to test our controllers, like assert redirected to and assert response. And what I would like to do is actually just call a method and see what it returns, or call a method and see what its side effects are, rather than using these custom assertions. I can't remember how that's implemented. What's it do? How does it interact with my controller object? Let's now look at the actual controller code. So here are three fairly standard actions that might exist in a controller. We've got an index action that's getting all the posts, and then we've got show and edit, and they're both looking up a single post. And a fairly standard abstraction that people often perform when we're doing this sort of work is to abstract that out into a private method and use a before filter to run it before the actions where it's applicable. Of course, we don't want it to run for every single action. The index action does not need a singular post variable. It needs to get all the posts. And so we don't want it to run for that action. Another thing to note about this is that we're using these instance variables. So there's been some discussion in the community about how Rails uses instance variables to pass down to the view, to share data with the view layer. And this is something that's very, very specific to Rails. And if you don't know about Rails, if you're just a Ruby programmer looking at this for the first time, it's very, very strange. Like, why am I setting these variables? The key thing to realize here is the reason we use these instance variables is because some things are applicable to some actions, and some things are applicable to other actions, and they're not necessarily shared. So in normal Ruby programming, if we want to share things between different objects, we do that by sending messages between objects. So we define methods and then call those methods. If we were to define a plural posts method in this controller, well, that might be okay, but it's not applicable to the show action or the edit action, and vice versa. And so really we can view the instance variables as your public methods for your action. So you may know of an idea called the single responsibility principle. This is the idea that one object should have one responsibility only. It should have one reason to change. And I think it's trivial to see that controllers violate the single responsibility principle. Actions are different. Your index action is doing something completely different to the destroy action. And so, as I was thinking about this, my dream was emerging. I wanted to have one object per action. So a controller is no longer an object that contains a whole bunch of methods that are my actions. I have one action each. And so I'm going to show some sort of pseudocode of what I was thinking of, how I wanted this to happen. So here I have an abstract class called singular. And this is not actually an action in itself, but it's just an abstract class that can be inherited from other actions. And it's defining the semantics of how to look up a post. And this can be inherited by other classes, and they all gain that behavior. So this is using normal object-oriented techniques for sharing behavior between objects, rather than this very Rails-specific before filter thing. And so my show action is not actually doing any work, it's just rendering, it's going to render the template. So it's just an empty shell class, but it's inheriting from Singular. And we can see also I've used a Rails-specific macro called helper method, which just means in my view, instead of calling controller.post, I can just call post. So that's just setting up a delegation effectively. And here I'm showing the update action, which is also a Singular action, so it also needs to be able to look up a post. But again, it can inherit that behavior from the abstract class. And in the run method, that's what actually happens when we run this action. So the update action is different from the show action because it's not about rendering a template, it's about doing some work and then redirecting off somewhere else. So my other dream was I wanted to do real unit testing. As we talked about, I wanted to make my tests faster, so I wanted to be able to not generate a huge rack response and test loads of Rails code every single time I want to check a piece of logic in my controller. I wanted to be able to just call methods. So I want to be able to create an object, my controller object, call a method and check some side effects. So check that the template was rendered. Or here, I'm assigning some parameters and check that the right post was found. So I kind of had this idea and I posted on Twitter about it, and then I just kind of got a bit depressed and I thought, oh, Rails will never be like this. It's just not like this. Wouldn't it be nice? But it's not like this. And I kind of let that be for a while. And then about a month later, I was working on my code. And I was thinking, well, actually, what would it take to implement this? Is it so wrong? Maybe I could try. And in actual fact, I played around with it, and I ended up extracting a plugin as a result of my experimentation called Focus Controller. I tried to think of a really controversial name, but I couldn't think of one, so I just went with something boring. And what it does is it just adjusts the Rails conventions. So as we've talked about, it adjusts the Rails conventions so that Rails knows that your actions are objects. And the second thing it does is it provides some test helper code to help you unit test these objects. And we'll talk about that a bit in a minute. So here's an actual example of how you can use it. You basically include a module in your object, and this means that you don't have to use it everywhere. You don't have to rewrite your app to use it. You can perfectly well write a new controller and use it in that place, but not in the rest of your app. And then you have a run method that is optional. If you have some things that have to happen when your action runs, then you can put them there. And you can also define other methods, as we've talked about, that you can call from your view if you wish. And so we then need to deal with routing, and this is one way to deal with routing. We could define a proc that just routes it through, but that's kind of ugly, isn't it? So there's this helper that you can just wrap around your routes that you want to follow these new conventions, and it just maps everything from the old way to the new, well, new-ish way. And so let's talk about testing. So you can functional test these objects, just like you're doing in Rails today, but I'm not excited about that. You can also unit test them. So as I'm talking about not generating this whole rack request and pushing it through the stack, you can get an instance of that object and call a method on it and check what happens. And here's a speed comparison. This is not just made up numbers. I did actually try this, and this is the relative speed between a functional test and then that test rewritten in a unit testing style. So it's way faster. It's way nicer. So I like this. I think it's better. It's helped me make my code better tested, and it's made it easier to test my code, and my tests are now really fast. So how about the future? Well, I said that Focus Controller does two things. It adjusts the conventions, and it provides some test helper code. I'm not actually very happy about this test helper code, because I think the hallmark of good object-oriented design is when you can just create objects, it's very explicit what the dependencies of those objects are, and then you can start using that object. And the fact that I actually have to provide this test helper code, to me, is a smell that our controllers are too difficult to start interacting with. And so in the future, I want to actually take a closer look at Rails and see if there are ways that we can potentially remove some of those dependencies. I haven't looked at it yet, so I don't want to say that there is or isn't. And I know that Rails has, the controller code in Rails has got a whole load better in Rails 3. but it's something I want to look at. So one day I just want to be able to create a controller object and then start firing things at it and do my unit testing that way. And I need your help. I need you to try this out. I need you to let me know your thoughts. If you think I'm completely wrong, then argue with me on Twitter or something. Write a blog post. But the underlying message here that I want to make is that sometimes in our community, we rant. Sometimes in our community, we dislike Rails for certain reasons, and maybe we write a blog post or rant on Twitter or whatever. And I really enjoy reading rants, and it makes me really happy when I get up in the morning and people say, Rails sucks, I'm moving to Node.js. But also, I really love it. Even more than I like reading rants, I love it when people write code and they make proposals for the future of our project, because it belongs to all of us. And secondly, I would like to say that it's your app. Maybe Rails is written by a bunch of guys that you don't know, but it's running on your server and it's part of your application. And if it's not filling your needs, then you need to take control and make it fill your needs and use that to help drive forward the direction of our project, because it's everyone's project. So, thank you very much. This is a link to the GitHub project. I've actually somehow managed to stay under 20 minutes, so we can do lots of questions. You might not get this cultural reference. If you don't worry. Hello.
Hey, I have one question. So I remember early years of Rails, 2006, 2007, when many people were so excited about that, and they said, oh, it's so cool, you can write your entire blog application just with 3 files, like model view controller. And it's not like in Java Enterprise, for example, where you have to create entirely each class for every method, and it's so complicated, and to do the same application, you just spend so much time. And with your presentation, which I saw, and many other presentations, so I have a feeling that Rails is moving towards this enterprise and complexity, and for a new guy coming to the project, if he's going to see this kind of design patterns, so it's going to be just again complicated. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, and I should point out that this sort of new style that I'm proposing is, it's been pointed out to me that it's very similar to structs in Java. So, oh my God, so enterprise. I sort of understand that, but to me this is simpler. I think it's conceptually, there's actually less to learn when we're just calling a post method on a controller object than if we actually have to learn the specific knowledge about the fact that instance variables are passed from the controller to the view or something. So actually, as a newcomer, I think that's easier. You're just calling methods. That's what objects do. Or that's what we do with objects. And the second thing to say is that I see some simplification with this pattern. So actually, before filters using this pattern, to me, are kind of irrelevant. So in normal controllers, we have the only and except option of before filters. They're completely irrelevant under this. You just use normal object-oriented techniques to share code as appropriate. So if it belongs in a certain action, then either inherit from an abstract class or mix in a module or whatever, and get that behavior you need, and don't get it where you don't need it. And then if it should be applied everywhere, then you could just use a wrap middleware for that. So I think with this pattern, actually, before filters are irrelevant. That's another piece of Rails-specific knowledge that you don't need to have. So what am I trying to say? I sympathize with that viewpoint, but I think that we can apply good object-oriented principles to Rails development without throwing out convention over configuration, and I think these two things can evolve in tandem.
But I consider it's simple if you can create block application with 3 files.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So specifically what you said about the files. But actually, how I've been using this, and this is a matter of style, but the way I've personally been using this technique is using, for instance, my posts controller as a module that's in a single file, and then all these classes are just in the same file. So you can just look at that file, that one file, and see what all your actions are in that file. Or alternatively, if you preferred, you could split them out into separate files. So, any more questions?
Hey, I agree with you that testing controllers is a huge pain in the ass. And I've taken the general approach that I no longer test the controllers because they're covered through integration tests. And if I'm writing a controller that's complicated enough to warrant a test for it, then I think it's a bad controller. Have you ran into a problem, like come across a situation like that, or just what do you think?
Okay, so I have a few responses to that. One is that in my experience, I deal with a lot of bad controllers. And sometimes that complexity seems somewhat inevitable. The second thing I'd like to say is that I sympathize with that viewpoint, and I agree with you about not over-testing, etc. But secondly, I do use unit testing to drive my design decisions. And so from that perspective, I do want to be able to get my controllers under test. And I had another point, but I can't remember. Sorry.
Now I, follow like one principle where I keep most of the logic in one module that can be tested. That's basic, just basic CRUD, and then I can include that, and then don't really have to worry about it so much anymore because it just seems like wasted effort, and you just fight the framework more than you can get that much. You can get stuff done.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with this plugin, I've been sort of trying to solve several problems, and one of them is to do with testing, but they're not all to do with testing. Like, so I know David disagrees with me on this, but I do really hate the instance variable sharing with a view thing. You know, as a newbie coming to Rails, that is something like very specific that you would have to learn. Whereas, like, why not just have objects, you know, talking to each other?
Hey. It's good that it reduces the time it takes to test your controllers if you want to unit test them, but have you done any benchmarking how this would affect an app in production in terms of memory usage, garbage collection, because you're, you know, like times in by 5 the amount of objects you're instantiating?
I haven't done any benchmarking, but I don't think it would affect it, because actually what happens when your Rails app processes a request is it creates an instance of the controller object, and then it routes through the code to the appropriate action that you're calling. So there are more objects, but there are not more objects being created at any one, you know, in any one given request. Does that make sense?
So you don't instantiate these sub-objects, these subclasses you're making?
You do instantiate them, but any one request is only going to one action, right? So whether that action is a method alongside several other methods in an object, or whether it's... You understand?
Yeah. Well, if you'd like to write a blog post about it, I'd be interested to...
Yeah, so I've written a fair amount of documentation on this project. I did it on the train on the way over here. So please check it out and have a read through. There's a bit more explained there than I could fit into 20 minutes.
So what do you think about use case-driven approach, which seems to be a generalization of what you said? So basically, use case-driven approach says that for every meaningful action user can do in a system, you should have a use case class. And this use case class has nothing to do with the controller. It is front-end independent. So possibly you can have different front-ends to this use case. And it's, of course, it's very easy to unit test it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I haven't personally experimented with doing that, but I think that's certainly a valid approach. There's not much to say, really. I think it's good to apply solid object-oriented principles to the problem. In any case, though, if I've got a controller object in my system, I want to be able to test it somehow. But yeah, I encourage people to just experiment with different techniques, and if you disagree with this, then feel free to try other things and then feed that back into the evolution of our framework. There was a guy at the front. No? Can this guy, he's been waiting a while.
Thanks. I hope you will not regret it. I will go ask a bit tough question. Controller example you mentioned. When in controller we have this before filter. If I understand it correctly, your alternative is that we have a module in which we have a class for each action. And to substitute this before filter logic, we need additional base class for actions which are going to use this. Mm-hmm. And actions which are not going to use this just simply will not inherit from this additional base class, right? Something like that.
That's correct. It doesn't have to be a class. You could actually include a module if you wanted to. It's just, all I'm saying is with this model, we can use normal object-oriented techniques for sharing behavior between classes. So be that inheritance or mix-ins or delegation or whatever.
Yeah, but I love this before filter so much. I a bit agree with my colleague of mine that's a bit too complex. Well, let's say we were learned, or we get used to thinking about controllers like encapsulation plays for several actions. And developers hate to change their habits. Mm-hmm. But we'll see, time will show us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
There's a question here.
Hi. How do you deal with testing things which belong in filters normally, like authentication or rewriting headers?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I think if you're using a before filter to implement some of the behavior of your action, then actually, again, you don't need to use a before filter for that. So an example of that is if I want something to happen before a bunch of actions, I could create a superclass or I could create a module, and then I could put that behavior in there, and then I could actually include that or inherit from that and call super. And then, so if I want to unit test that code, I can then unit test my module or my abstract class or whatever. If it is something more generic, if it's something like making sure that the user is always logged in if they access the application, I think that's a use case for rack middleware and stuff like that rather than controller code. I'm not saying that before filters are always pointless under this model. I think that most of the time they are, though.
So, first of all, that was a great talk. I really like how you break conventions and the rules in order to apply proper.
Can you speak up? Closer.
I love how you break the rules and Rails in order to apply a proper object-oriented design there. So I guess the first question is, when do you move to Berlin and help me fix Travis in that regard? But the second, more serious question is, if instance variable sharing gives you a pain, how about the fact that we use procedural helper methods in our views? And what do you think about applying the same thing to the view layer and have object-oriented view classes?
Mm-hmm. So there's been a fair amount said about the presenter pattern. Have people heard about that? The presenter pattern? A few? Maybe about half. So the presenter pattern is the idea of basically, instead of having a module full of methods that you call from your view, you have objects that... So the idea there is to abstract... Okay, let me start again. People create views, view templates, and then they start off simple, and then they start putting all sorts of conditionals and loops and stuff like that, and suddenly they become not so simple. And so that's where helpers originally came from. So it's the idea of abstracting out some logic into some Ruby code that we can put under test, and it's just a bit more manageable. But helpers, as Sven said, are not object-oriented at all. So this is just a procedural programming. And so there's a line of thought about presenters where you have objects that take away different responsibilities, and you can instantiate those objects and then use them to abstract away this logic. So I agree with that, basically. I would like it if we think about having something like that in Rails out of the box in some way. I think you can clap. Yeah, I would like us to do that, but there are different views on the core team, and there are often different views on the core teams about things generally. And I'm not going to stand here and say that we are going to do that, but personally, I would like it if we made this easier for people and encourage people. Often with Rails, David said about how in Rails, like, one of the greatest things we have is empty folders, so that you know where to put your stuff. And with presenters, I think maybe there's something to be said for helping people along with that.
I guess,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.